The late economist Milton Friedman was one of the boldest and most provocative figures of our time. He was born in 1912, making this the 100th anniversary of his birth. Milton Friedman received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976, and as a professor at the University of Chicago, he transformed a generation of economists. It's safe to say his work influenced the entire field. He was an author and an advisor to several presidents. His ideas won him millions of advocates and opponents all over the world. While some place a greater emphasis on financial equality, Friedman advocated economic liberty. In 1980, he shared his ideas with millions of TV viewers in the landmark PBS series, Free to Choose. Hi, I'm Emily Rooney, and here, surrounded by images of the University of Chicago, Milton's intellectual home, we'll engage four distinguished guests in a discussion of the relevance of Friedman's ideas today.
Major funding was provided by CME Group. For more than 160 years, through continuous innovation in trading and technology, CME Group products have provided businesses with the opportunity to manage risk amid the changing financial landscape. BP is dedicated to helping meet America's energy needs. Our investments support jobs across the country and reaffirm our commitment to the U.S. that began over a century ago. Additional funding was provided by John A. Gunn and Cynthia Fry Gunn, the Melvin S. Cohen Foundation, FedEx Corporation, the Ellie Phillips Family Foundation, and Corrett Foundation.
Milton Friedman believed free markets were the key to economic prosperity. He also argued that free markets were the surest path to both personal and political freedom. It was these very opportunities that prompted Friedman's parents to immigrate to America. That story of opportunity was part of Friedman's 1980 landmark series, Free to Choose. But do Friedman's ideas still hold up today? Are they still relevant? Those are the questions we will pose to our panelists today. Joining me are Kevin Murphy, professor of economics at the University of Chicago; Brad DeLong, professor of economics at the University of California at Berkeley; Rajan, professor of finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business; and Dani, professor of political economy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to all of you. All right, but first, here are some thoughts from Milton Friedman himself in 1980, introducing his theory on the power of the market and the allure it held for his immigrant parents.
For the immigrants who were welcomed by this statue, America was truly a land of opportunity. They poured ashore in their best clothes, eager and expectant, carrying what little they owned. They were poor, but they all had a great deal of hope. Once they arrived, they found, as my parents did, not an easy life, but a very hard life. There were many rewards for hard work, enterprise, and ability. Life was hard, but opportunity was real. There were few government programs to turn to, and nobody expected them. But also, there were few rules and regulations. There were no licenses, no permits, no red tape to restrict them. They found, in fact, a free market, and most of them thrived on it.
This is exactly the same kind of a factory that my mother worked in when she came to this country for the first time at the age of 14, almost 90 years ago. And if there had not been factories like this here then, at which she could have started to work and earned a little money, she wouldn't have been able to come. And if I existed at all, I'd be a Russian or a Hungarian today instead of American. Of course, she didn't stay here a long time. She stayed here while she learned the language, while she developed some feeling for the country, and gradually she was able to make a better life for herself. Similarly, the people who are here now, they are like my mother. A place like this gives them a chance to get started. They're not going to stay here very long or forever. On the contrary, they and their children will make a better life for themselves as they take advantage of the opportunities that a free market provides to them.
But in the past 50 years, we've been squandering that inheritance by allowing government to control more and more of our lives instead of relying on ourselves. We need to rediscover the old truths that the immigrants knew in their bones, what economic freedom is and the role it plays in preserving personal freedom.
Raghu, Milton Friedman speaks of the virtues of these sweatshops, of these factories, the family history there. But if you walked into any one of those shops now, these aren't people who are here for a short time and they're going to move on. They're lifers. They would say to Milton Friedman, what are you talking about?
They could, but I mean, I think you need places where people who don't have skills can start. Hopefully they go on from there to better places. If you required to start with that these places have to be really well equipped, have a lot of safety standards, they really can't get the first footing on the road to economic progress. I think that's important. When you look at some of these third world countries, people don't get jobs if those jobs require the kinds of safety standards that we have in first world countries. That's why it sometimes pays to say, okay, let's reduce regulations a little bit here. Let these people get on board. Over time, they will demand better regulations.
Will they? Because weren't his parents the exception rather than the rule of moving on and getting an education?
Well, look around the United States. The level of regulation now, the safety standards, much better than anywhere else in the world. Look at US companies working in other parts of the world. They are, in some sense, pressurized by people in the United States to have better standards there, and they are lifting standards there. But to demand that of everybody right off the get-go will actually keep a lot of people out of jobs that could, in the longer run, make them much better off.
On the other hand, Milton Friedman was also saying the virtues of no regulations when his parents came to the country, and Raghu was saying, well, yeah, we actually need them. We need them certainly in the factories.
I mean, I guess the key is we need to strike a balance between taking care of things where regulation can work and where regulation reaches too far. And as Raghu said, I think it can reach too far and really squelch opportunity rather than foster opportunity. But you also have to remember, and I think Raghu was right, people move on, and it's not just them that move on, but it's their children. And the children of many people today who are very successful, went to college, are people whose parents had far less opportunity. You can look at all the Asian immigrants to the United States, who many of whom are Indian immigrants who came to the United States, who might own a convenience store, and their children become doctors, lawyers, move on. So that story that Milton told still holds true today, and it's a big draw for people, not only because they themselves can move forward, but even more so because it creates the opportunity for their children to move forward.
In some ways, I think the regulation, no regulations, cutting the joint, not cutting at the joint. I think if we had Milton here today, he would say that what the sweatshop does not need is an OSHA inspector coming through every month to see whether it meets requirement X, Y, Z, and W. What he would say is what the sweatshop needs is strict liability for industrial accidents on the part of the manufacturer and a generous system of compensation for industrial accidents in order to give the manufacturer who has the knowledge for how to design a safe and productive workplace the incentive to design a safe and productive workplace. You don't need the OSHA, Milton would say, but you do need the liability system in order to make the incentives lie where they ought to.
I think we all agree that we don't want to have the regulations in the United States of 2012 and take them as a package and apply them to either in Hong Kong in 1980 or for that matter in Ethiopia today, that what we see in the West as sweatshops are really truly the first steps to increasing economic opportunity. It's a first step of transformation when you take basically people off the farm, peasants, and put them into urban areas where actually they do make a better living, and that's why they actually moved from the farm. And the trick, and I think that's the difference between countries like Hong Kong and the United States in an early area that managed this transition, the trick is to get these simple garment factories, then to turn them into textile factories, and then to chemicals, and then simple electronics, and increasingly up in this this stepping stone process of economic development. And there, I think the government actually does have a role to play, because in all of these transitions, there has been mixed economies that have achieved that.
Milton Friedman, though, was saying in many ways we're kind of misstepping. We're not taking the stepping stone, that we're squandering our inheritance. What does he mean by that?
I think what he's worried is that, in some sense, you get rich, people demand a lot more. And in that sense, they demand safer working conditions. They demand better environment. So, for example, one of the things you find as countries get richer is that they demand more environmental improvement. And that's a strong trend in that direction, that initially as countries industrialize, maybe the environment goes down, but then people get richer, they demand more. What he's worried is that there's sort of a feedback effect where we go too far, and that very things that got us rich become imperiled by the regulations that we demand because we're rich. So there's kind of a push and pull there that I think he's focusing in on.
1980, he's just lived through the 1970s. The world price of oil tripled in 1973, and the immediate political reaction wasn't to say, oh, oil is now an expensive commodity, we need to let its price rise so that people have the right incentives to figure out how to move to a more energy efficient economy. The initial reaction was, well, it's not fair that the oil companies make an awful lot of money off of this. And so throughout the 1970s, with this bizarre and complicated regulatory regime during which there was old oil, and old oil was sold at a different lower price than new oil, and the whole thing got substantially bollocksed up. It's reacting against that kind of political climate, in which the first reaction to a change in supply is to do something to keep it from showing up as a change in price, that's making Friedman fear that we were about to squander the advantages that the market economy had given us.
So it wasn't just that, as Brad says, that that there was some overshooting in the kind of government regulations that were going in many ways in the extreme direction. It was also that I think Milton Friedman was worried that whenever the government acted in the interests of certain people, that we would close off avenues of opportunity for others, so that the workers who want better conditions for themselves might then prevent others off the farm or from coming in and having the kinds of opportunities that they had earlier. So it wasn't, in his view, it wasn't just the shouldn't of government, government shouldn't, but it was also that couldn't, in the sense that the government couldn't actually act in the common interest in some sense.
And you have to think about who sets regulations. And that was a big issue that Milton Friedman focused on. Often it's the big incumbents in an industry. I mean, think about the airline industry, which was clearly, we had wonderful service at that time.
We did.
But it was very expensive. Very few people traveled. For some. Yeah. But it wasn't a mass market industry. Yeah. And what deregulation of that industry allowed was a whole set of new entrants to come in who could cut price. You wouldn't have seen Southwest flourish as it has done in those times. And similarly, I think across the board, there are a number of industries which were overregulated in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And in the 70s is when people started saying, this is perhaps a little too much. We need to reduce regulations so as to increase growth. Trucking was an example, airlines another example. And at the end of it, there are mixed opinions about whether everybody likes what happened, but by and large, it has helped the broad masses in the economy.
Yeah, so I would add to that is Milton was influenced a lot by his colleague George Stigler, who realized a lot what we're saying here, which is that once you get into regulation, even if people think of Milton as sort of pro-business, but he recognized that business would be one of the first people to take advantage of regulation, and they would use regulation to exclude their competitors, to entrench their position in the business, and to do other things. And he was very aware of that was one of the things that would happen. So he sort of saw regulation as it would end up being, as opposed to what you might perceive you could do. And he had a very much, you know, be careful what you wish for because it's going to bring a lot of other things with it.
I'm not sure he could have foreseen what's happening here.
Of the wave of deregulations. We had telecommunications, we had trucking, we had air travel, we had energy, we had finance. I say we'd do 4 out of 5 have been good things.
4 or 5 have been good things.
Yes.
I mean, I think the big puzzle here in some sense is looking at it from what Milton, from the perspective of what Milton Friedman was saying and what we've been discussing here. There are all these many ways in which government regulation can go wrong. Yet, which are the most successful societies today in the world? Which are the countries that have grown rich and wealthy? These are the countries where actually the role of the government is much more important than the poorer parts of the world. These are the countries where public expenditures, government taxation are much higher than in the rest of the world. So in some sense, you know, that the lesson of history is that broadly speaking, governments and markets have expanded together rather than in opposition to each other.
I can't move off this segment before we bring up the issue of immigration. I'm not sure Milton Friedman could have anticipated, although he saw what was happening, certainly in the sweatshops and all across America in terms of people coming here. So whether legal or illegal, I mean, the role that the immigrants have played in changing the face of our economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think Milton Friedman would say if you move someone in a sewer tunnel from south of the U.S.-Mexico border to north today and let them stay there, you've just boosted their lifetime income by $500,000 without doing much, if any, damage to people on the north. That restrictions on human movement are, Friedman would say, one of the very biggest sources of both inequality and inefficiency in the world today.
So just on these points, I mean, I don't think any of us dispute the fact that we need a balance. It's not zero government and all markets, or all government and no markets. But getting that balance is really very, very hard. And that's really what it's all about. Take the one industry that I believe Brad doesn't think should be deregulated, finance. I mean, yes, we have seen some excesses there, and of course one can debate for a long time how much was regulation or deregulation. But imagine finance before it got deregulated, when instead of interest payments, we got a toaster. Now,
do remember that.
You know, that was also problematic. So we need to know how we get the balance right.
All right, moving on here. Back in 1980, Milton Friedman thought there was no better example of the power of the market than the bustling city of Hong Kong. Let's take a look.
If you want to see how the free market really works, this is the place to come. Hong Kong, a place with hardly any natural resources. About the only one you can name is a great harbor. Yet the absence of natural resources hasn't prevented rapid economic development. Ships from all nations come here to trade because there are no duties, no tariffs on imports or exports. The power of the free market has enabled the industrious people of Hong Kong to transform what was once barren rock into one of the most thriving and successful places in Asia. Aside from its harbor, the only other important resource of Hong Kong is people, over 4.5 million of them. This thriving, bustling, dynamic city has been made possible by the free market, indeed the freest market in the world. The free market enables people to go into any industry they want, to trade with whomever they want, to buy in the cheapest market around the world, to sell in the dearest market around the world. But, most important of all, if they fail, they bear the cost. If they succeed, they get the benefit. When a businessman faces trouble, a market threatens to disappear, or a new competitor arises, there are two things he can do. He can turn to the government for a tariff or a quota or some other restriction on competition, or he can adjust and adapt. In Hong Kong, the first option is closed. Hong Kong is too dependent on foreign trade so that the government has simply had to adopt a policy of complete non-interference. That's tough on some individuals, but it's extremely healthy for the society as a whole. In all this, the government of Hong Kong has played an important part, not only by what it has done, but as much by what it has refrained from doing. It has made sure that laws are enforced and contracts honored. It has provided the conditions in which a free market can work. Sometimes it looks like chaos, and so it is. But underneath, it's highly organized by the impersonal forces of a free marketplace.
So, Kevin, what do you think his larger point was by going to Hong Kong? What was the lesson for America?
I think, you know, probably there was a lesson for America, but probably a broader lesson, which is really that, and we kind of got into this in the last session, which is matching the level of government involvement to your situation. And for example, if you contrast Hong Kong to a number of other countries around the world where they have regulations that have the effect of forcing people, for example, to go into the informal economy because they have regulations that don't fit the economy. So we talked earlier about, you know, there has to strike a balance. Well, if you have a world in which a vast number of people are being forced to go to the informal economy to avoid the regulation, I think you know which side of the balance you're on. That doesn't mean you have to be Hong Kong, but you have to be aware that you can go too far. And even if you're trying to do good things, like put in safety regulations and all kinds of other things that you're requiring firms to do for their workers, if that means the workers don't work there and they work someplace else in the informal economy, you've gone too far. And so I think that's the lesson that I would take away.
But Hong Kong is interesting. It's interesting that Milton Friedman focuses on Hong Kong. It is clearly, with the exception of the government's role in public housing, which has been extensive, Hong Kong is a free market economy. But there aren't that many other places you can go to find that. And if you can just go, you know, next door to Singapore, which is an economy that is equally dependent on trade, has developed at an equally rapid pace, is roughly as rich as Hong Kong is. You have a government that has behaved in a very different way. In fact, the government has led in investing in new industries and diversifying the economy. That's not to say that the Singaporean model is for everybody. I agree with Kevin that all those countries have different circumstances. But I think it would be wrong to say that it's a particular model that worked in Hong Kong that is so reliant on the market and just basically says the government shouldn't do anything to restructure economies necessarily fits all other countries.
Do you agree with that, Brad, that the non-interference of government is the key to the success of Hong Kong?
I remember thinking back when I first saw it that it was a little too clever. I was thinking not only of Hong Kong, but also of Singapore, and not only of Singapore, but also of Calcutta, and the fact that the government of Hong Kong was the British Empire, right, and that up until 1948, the ruling legal regimes in Hong Kong and in Calcutta were the same, as they were both parts of the British Empire. And yet, one, you have extraordinary development success, even by 1948. And in the other, in Calcutta, you have a much more fraught and much less successful situation, even though the underlying legal market order is the same.
I mean, one of the things you want to ask is how much competition played a role in Hong Kong as opposed to the size of the government. And clearly an economy which is so exposed to trade as Hong Kong was, unlike Calcutta, which is part of a bigger hinterland, a bigger country. The other thing is, you have to be a little careful about Hong Kong. There's a lot of control over land, which becomes a big source of the government's revenues. And it's not entirely free, the way that land is actually maintained and sold. So you have to be a little careful about going too far and calling it entirely free. That said, I think the role of reducing the regulation on opening businesses as opposed to countries that have enormous amounts of regulations on how to start businesses. I think that's one important lesson the world can learn from places like Hong Kong. Free up the process for new companies to start.
Well, what about that? On that point, I'll ask you, Brett, about taxation, because Hong Kong taxes its corporations at roughly half of what America does. Is that part of the impetus for new business and corporations?
I'd say part, but I'd say a relatively small part. I mean, we don't manage to collect a lot of money from our taxes on corporations.
Right, that's true.
Yeah, but I do say I'm reminded of a paper Dani wrote about cashews in Mozambique quite a while ago, about how the government of Mozambique decides it would be very good to encourage its cashew processing industry. And so passes laws to say that Mozambican cashew farmers aren't allowed to sell their unshelled cashews to India, where there are existing Indian factories that could produce them more cheaply. and say that kind of micro-development decision by the government of Mozambique, whether it's made out of a desire to actually help Mozambique grow faster, or just because certain politicians have had cocktails with certain South African investors in local businesses. That's the kind of thing that I think has broadly been destructive over the past 100 years, and that's the kind of thing that Hong Kong avoided.
Are you as dismissive of the tax structure as Brad is?
I agree that actually taxes, I don't think, are the overwhelming determinant of industrial development or where investments are made. There are much, much more important factors, both in terms of how government-friendly, market-friendly, business-friendly the government is, as well as what the profit opportunities are, which are really, of which taxes are only a small part. If you're in a poor economy where most of the people are in agriculture, you have very few industry, the first entrepreneur that's going to invest in a garment plant faces inordinate risks. He doesn't know whether he's going to succeed, whether he's going to have the inputs that he needs. And in those kinds of environments, it's very important to encourage people to undertake those kinds of investments. Sometimes, as in the case of Hong Kong, the market incentives are enough. But in many other cases, I think the government actually needs to nudge entrepreneurs by providing them with some incentives, by providing them sometimes with a little bit of protection from too much competition. Right. Because competition is great, but if you put a kid into a classroom with people whose abilities are just a little bit better than his, maybe he will work harder. But if you put him in a classroom with people who are 4 or 5 grades ahead of him, he might just as well give up and say, I will never succeed given the difference. So I think there's a lot of countries that have grown up very rapidly, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and China, of course, being a hugely important example, are countries where governments have given market forces a gentle nudge, if you will, to make this process go.
I think the difficult task there is when to bring in competition, and often countries don't bring it in. And those are the countries that don't grow. Yes, they nudge, but they nudge too much. They protect their producers and they don't move on and open up to competition. The ones that have been successful, and you read backwards, it looks like they did wonderful things with the government, then they opened up at the right time. Now there's these fantastic countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, and so on. But it is an experiment that has not worked a lot of the time. I do want to go back to one point about Hong Kong. Milton talked about contracts being enforced, that courts were important, police is important, roads are important. In other words, the point that Dani made earlier, there has to be an equal development of the government enforcement process in a way that is effective, not too burdensome. That's what also helps growth of the economy.
We're going to hear more from Milton on Hong Kong, because he actually didn't at all shy away from the ugly side of Hong Kong either, the abject poverty, the slums, but still he believed even poor people were ultimately better served by a free market economy. Here's Milton again.
Of course, many of the people who pour into Hong Kong will end up in conditions that most of us in the West would find appalling. Hong Kong is very far from Utopia. It has its slums, its crime, its desperately poor people. But the people are free. That's, after all, why so many of them have come here. Here, they have the freedom and the opportunity to better themselves, to improve their lot, and many succeed. There's appalling poverty in Hong Kong, it's true, but the conditions of the people have been getting better over time. And that poverty, appalling to us, because we're accustomed to much higher standards of life, is not poverty as viewed by most of the people in the world. It's a poverty to which they would aspire, a state of affairs that they would like to achieve. There is an enormous amount of poverty in the world everywhere. There is no system that's perfect. There's no system that's going to eliminate completely poverty, in whatever sense. The question is, which system has the greatest chance? Which is the best arrangement for enabling poor people to improve their lot? And on that, the evidence of history speaks with a single voice. I do not know any exception to the proposition that if you compare like with like, the freer the system, the better off the ordinary poor people have been. When people are free, they are able to use their own resources most effectively, and you have a great deal of productivity, a great deal of opportunity. The major beneficiaries are always the small man. The man who has power, who's at the top of a society, he's going to do well whatever kind of a society you have. It's the society which gives the small man the opportunity to go his way, which is going to benefit him the most.
Well, Brad, you brought this up before. I mean, in the 1980s, Hong Kong was under British rule. Now it's the People's Republic of China. Milton Friedman believed that
it's still one country, two systems.
He believed that once you had economic freedom, you would have personal, social, political freedom. That is certainly not the case in Hong Kong now.
The link between, or at least the inevitable march from economic freedom to personal freedom, social freedom, and political freedom does seem to have gotten itself interrupted over the past generation and a half. And I'd say the verdict of history is that Milton was much too optimistic about the extent to which growing and developing economic freedom would carry personal and political freedom and indeed democracy with it. But he had fairly good reason for his judgment. You know, that was essentially the process that first the Netherlands and then Britain and then France and other Western European countries had followed, by which economic development and the rise of the middle class had been followed by, you know, the fall of aristocracies and kings from political participation and the steady onward march to democracy. That's something that seems to have stopped, or at least to have slowed down, outside of Latin America over the past 40 or 50 years, and I don't think I understand why.
Well, still, I mean, I think with the exception of oil countries, there's scarcely any country in the world that's rich and hasn't become democratic at the same time. I think what happens, as Brad says, that once you have the makings of a middle class wants not just the material goodies, but they also want to have a voice. They want to have control over their political futures, and they don't want to be ruled by dictators and their cronies. This is what, of course, we've seen in the Arab Spring. Maybe quite surprisingly, the countries where the revolution started were the countries that were doing economically better, like Tunisia and Egypt, not the backward ones. That's why I think China is quite worried about the copycat effect, and I think ultimately China will not get rich until it becomes democratic. But the question is, what's the best way to get there and what the role of the markets is? I think what we've seen as a mixed economy actually has made that transition more likely.
Also, I think we've seen tremendous economic growth at rates which didn't exist in the past. So if you look at Britain's expansion, economic expansion took 2 centuries, political expansion took a century. What Britain did over that time, China's done in 30 years. It may be that it takes longer for political expansion to happen, and I have no doubt, for the reasons that Dani mentioned, but also the fact that at some point, to get further economic expansion, you need people to have ideas. And ideas often require a freer spirit. That means political change. And you can see that happening in China, especially with the new technology that we have. Twitter, Facebook, or their versions of it. There's a lot more discussion. And I'm hopeful that over time, you will see the democratic expansion across the world.
So does either one of you believe that you can have a successful capital economy and an authoritarian rule?
You know, it's not, I think there are 2 links. You can think about running from success to democracy and from democracy to success. The consensus of the work in the academic literature, and I think the consensus among economists, is there's a strong link from success to democracy. That, and this is what Dani was talking about, people get wealthier. One of the things you want when you're wealthier is you want a voice, you want a democracy. The link in the other direction, there are countries who have been very successful without necessarily freeing things up first. So I should say the link is stronger. Running from success to democracy is probably the side of the equation. Now, but I would like to stress what Raghu just talked about, which is the 2 work well together. That is, if you have freedom, that helps you run a free market economy, that people are able to take advantage of the things. And if you have a free market economy, you don't have to control people to the extent you do if you have a less free market economy where you basically have to tell people what to do. So it's hard to really, they're complementary, I guess, the way economists like to talk about. They work well together. And that's why we think a place like China, as it gets richer, it's likely to become freer. And it's going to be hard to keep getting richer if they don't get freer. And
yeah, because when you look at Hong Kong, it really looks like the majority of people live in the ugly side, in this abject poverty, the slums. That's the way, certainly back when Milton Friedman was there. And for him to say that some of these people subscribed to being like that, like that's the way they want to be, that's hard to...
Oh, they were vastly richer than their parents and their grandparents had been.
And they became vastly richer still, because today's Hong Kong is not the Hong Kong that we saw on the screen.
It's vastly richer today than it was then, and they've continued to grow.
It's still huge...
Yeah, but it is the argument that if you don't have places where people without industrial skills can work productively and learn the skills of handling machinery that you need for an industrial economy, then if you get rid of those sweatshops and get rid of those occupations, you won't have a situation in which everyone's an upper middle class denizen of Chicago. What you'll have is a situation in which you have a huge number of unemployed or informally employed people who are even poorer than the people of Hong Kong. They're just out of sight.
So what you need, in some sense, is as you grow richer, you have to give people the capability, the ability to increase their capacities, to get better education, to get better health care. And so again, this goes back to both things have to move together. But as you get richer, you have the wherewithal to acquire those things, to spend for those things. And I think that's what you see. Both things, both the quality of government and the quality of products that the government ensures for you, as well as the private sector, tend to grow together.
Let's not forget that in 1980, the Berlin Wall was still up. What Milton Friedman is saying here, he's talking about it's a debate about systems. There is still the question of whether the capitalist free market system will be the system of the future or whether the communist system will win. From today's vantage point, that question has completely disappeared. And it's no small tribute to Milton Friedman that when the Berlin Wall fell down, there was no question as to which direction they were going to go to. They were going to go in the direction of having some version of a free market economy. So I think today it's no longer, is it a centrally planned economy versus a market economy? Is it an authoritarian system versus a democratic system? I think largely those questions have been settled, and I think the issues are getting the balance right.
So that we live after the end of history, in a sense.
Well, it turns out to have been a lot more history.
In which case it would have been nice if Milton Friedman had also talked not just about the free market, but about universal education and infrastructure. And I don't know what, cheap broadband for all.
But he did talk about
he did
elsewhere.
That.
I mean, he talked about universal education and relying on the market to try to create that. Mm-hmm. And I think that message is very much alive today, that we know we need to do something to improve our education system. This is now getting away from other countries and back to the United States, because we have a very important issue where we have large segments of our economy, people who are not receiving the kind of education they need to succeed where our economy is now, let alone where it's headed to.
Should the government intervene in that?
Well, the government is intervening. I think the government is in some ways the problem.
I think that's right. And I think, if you say, what's the solution here? I think the solution is we have to get more competition and more ways to get people what they need, because the people want it. If you talk to parents, there aren't parents out there by and large who don't care about the education of their children. They just are in a system where they don't have the best opportunities.
Well, but unlike in Hong Kong, people here have the personal freedom to make change, but many of them don't.
There's a question about whether parents are in fact the best advocates for their children, or whether all parents are the best advocates for their children. And there are also the questions of what's the government's role in education and how should it be structured? Should it provide incentives? Should it provide funding? Should it actually run schools? And I'd like to hear Kevin on this because he's the only former educational bureaucrat we have.
No, so I mean, I guess what I would say is I think about, and you should say, well, let's take education. Should the government provide education, or should we do, like Milton advocated, a more of a voucher type system? And I would just say, think about the contrast between a rich suburb where you got a really good choice. You can go to the private school or you can go to the public school, and you're going to get a great education either place you go. In the inner city, you know, a lot of the best opportunities for people are the Catholic schools and other schools that are there because the public schools have failed them miserably. So, you know, people always think of the government as the great equalizer. But I would say there's probably more inequality between the suburban public school and the urban public school than there is between the suburban private and the urban private. So rather than in that case being the great equalizer, the government actually seems to be fostering inequality. And
even though the money is roughly the same.
Right, but it's not money that does the trick. It's education that does the trick.
All right, well, on to our next segment. Milton Friedman borrowed this next story from Leonard Read's I, Pencil because he thought no story better illustrated the meaning of Adam Smith's invisible hand at work, the idea that people will come together to do the right thing at the right price.
Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was a magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
So, Dani, would you agree with that this is the best example of the free market system coming together, trading goods and services, the ability to do something, the right thing at the right price? Is that a good example?
It's a wonderful segment, isn't it? Well, I did.
It goes on and on, by the way. That's an abbreviated segment.
I did bring a pencil with me. I actually don't use a pencil, so I had to ask my daughter to give me one before I came here. And I knew that it was going to be made in China. And indeed, it is made in China, as most pencils today in the world are. And I think today, a modern-day Milton Friedman would want to ask, why is this pencil made in China? Clearly, some of it has to do with the private initiative, entrepreneurship, hard work, and thrift of the Chinese people. Maybe most of it is that. But it's not that China has the best graphite in the world. There's much better graphite in South Korea and in Mexico. It's not that the wood is more plentiful in China than it is in Indonesia or Brazil. There's much better technology in pencil making in the United States or Germany. I think it's one major reason why most pencils today, just like in so many manufactured goods, are being made in China, which is that the Chinese government has had a very concerted policy of stimulating industrialization, of supporting industries. In the case of pencils, it's been partly environmental policies that have kept the price of wood cheap. It has been export subsidies. It has been the role of state investments to transfer technology and train the initial batch of workers. It has been intervention in foreign currency markets to keep the Chinese currency cheap so that they can compete in dollar terms. So it has been, today, this is just one example, but the reality of the world today is that all these mechanisms of market allocation have in them the role of the government completely mixed up.
Wait, you go into any Walmart, and it's not just a pencil, it's 3/4 of the goods are made in China. And isn't it largely because the one thing you didn't mention was the abuse of workers there? I mean, they're paying pennies to some of these workers on the dollar, and they don't care about their work environment.
Well, I think there's some of that, but I do think it's changing. I mean, increasingly, it's not China anymore. It's Vietnam, it's Cambodia, it's Laos, and sometimes India, where this stuff is coming from. Why? Because Chinese wages have started going up. And the Chinese worker now no longer wants those rock-bottom wages, is no longer content having a undervalued renminbi, because when they go outside, they can't buy stuff. So China has a decision to make at this point. Stay the old course and see eventually its markets wither away, or move to a new structure where it starts buying more, consuming more. And that, to my mind, is something we have to remember, that our future in industrial countries is going to be exporting to countries out there as their demand increases, as they become richer. And so this is a time, it's tempting to look at the policies there and say they were awful, but they were policies that industrial countries also followed when they were poor. But they changed. And you have to change to a more market-oriented policy if you are to continue growing. And I think China, if it doesn't realize that, had better realize it soon. And if it makes that change, it will be a great force for the kind of cooperation that Milton talked about in the segment.
Yeah, I would say, you know, if he was doing that example today, he would probably use something other than a pencil. There's been some recent work, people have talked about the iPod and where the iPod's made around the world. And officially it says made in China, but you know, that's where it's assembled. But in fact, the vast majority of the value is actually created elsewhere in the United States and in Japan and everywhere. And I think somebody calculated the Chinese contribute $6 of the value of a $300 iPod, even though it says made in China. So, and that's even a greater example of Milton's kind of specialization. And I agree with Raghuram that you really have to focus on, you know, these people have had low wages, but they're much better than their wages were before, where they were in rural agriculture. And there's been a tremendous movement of people in China from being very poor to being poor. And they're getting to be not so poor.
What have you got on your iPhone there, Brad?
The other one is blank. It's Greg Linden and company at UC Berkeley.
Yes.
Yay, Berkeley, that did it. Although the iPod does tend to undermine the argument that nobody plans this, because a bunch of somebodies certainly did plan this, even though they didn't centrally plan it, in the sense that Apple has all these market interfaces with its huge number of suppliers, customers, and so forth. This thing was still designed rather than a spontaneous creation. But for the China point, I would say that the reason that 60% of the items on sale in Walmart are from China are because we made a conscious decision that a strong dollar was in America's interest and that China should sell us manufactured goods while we would sell them bonds. And that was a decision on our part about how to use the market to our long-run national advantage and prosperity.
Should we be concerned about the loss of jobs here?
I'd say it's a decision, that a policy that's 10 years after its sell-by date. That to say a strong dollar is in America's interest is one thing when it's the 1990s and everyone wants to invest in the emerging technologies of Silicon Valley and we're at full employment.
It was a policy that Milton Friedman would have approved of, wasn't it? Because after all, it is the U.S. just let the dollar determine in free markets for currency and didn't intervene, and that's why it got the dollar that it did.
Well, there's a question as to what a free foreign exchange market is at a very deep level. Yes.
But the point is, of course, that it was country like China and maybe Vietnam, a few other Southeast Asian countries that could take advantage of this. And they had the right policies in place to do so.
But if people are willing to loan you money at very low rates and sell you goods to buy with that money at very low prices, you generally think a free market will take advantage of that.
Yes, but going back to what Kevin said earlier, I mean, they're making the pencils. We're selling them legal services, consulting services, professorial services, and getting a lot more per hour than they're getting. And this is what we need to make sure that the rest of the people that Kevin talked about who are being left behind, can actually do, which is improve the quality of the output, of the capabilities of people in industrial countries so that they don't see those things as a threat. They want to make the pencils, great, but they have to pay me much more for what I'm producing. That's a grand bargain. Right now it's bonds we're selling, but it'd be great if we could sell stuff that was not debt.
That actually employs people.
What about the role that trade plays in ensuring world peace? I mean, let's face it, China couldn't afford to go to war with us, and we couldn't afford to go to war with them. So does trade on that magnitude ensure?
This was an argument that Norman Angell made back before World War I, and it was a very good and a very convincing argument, but it was totally wrong. I mean, and he argued huge books about how war was so expensive that only an idiot in a government would launch one, and lo and behold, we've had lots of idiots in the 20th and 21st century.
I mean, the First World War came at the end of the flowering of the first great era of globalization, and I think we would be making a mistake to believe that that just because we live in this era of globalization that we've put behind international conflict behind us.
And Second World War followed a very different region, so the linkage is pretty weak between those two things. I think we'd conclude.
But there is a broad point that, say, go back to Adam Smith back in 1760 Scotland, and go north from where Adam Smith lives near Edinburgh. And there are people who will, if they see you, they may kill you because you're a clan enemy, or they may befriend you if you're a clan member, or you may be a stranger to them, in which case they'll just steal from you. Yes. And that's an uncomfortable world to live in. By contrast, we live in a world in which practically everyone we interact with
wants to sell us something.
We want to sell them something, or they want to sell us something, and we'll both go away happy. And so most of our interactions are with people who are going to do something for us, so we are going to do something for them. And that makes for a much more peaceful and friendly world than one in which you're, I don't know what, a Douglas, and you're scared of the McConnells down the road.
But there's one place where I think increasing growth and trade creates frictions, and that's for resources. And right now we see a lot of competition for resources. It's business-like, it's genteel, but it could turn ugly. And especially when you think about resources like water, where it's life or death whether you have access to water. And that may be where the frictions get more over time, even when we have such a globalized world.
So tell me, does global warming mean there's more or less snowpack in the Himalayas, and more or less water in the great river valleys of Asia?
When people listening to this today are going to be saying, oh, this is all great and good for China and the free markets and everything, but there are people out in the Midwest and industrial complexes, farmers. They're thinking, I'm unemployed. I'm never going to work again. Nobody's going to come in and rescue me. I don't have a skill. I'm not going to morph into the next thing. How does that translate into?
Friedman thought he had an answer, right? That he thought that if all you did was have the Federal Reserve make sure that the money supply grew at 5% per year, year in and year out, that we wouldn't have large business cycles and wouldn't have large episodes of cyclical unemployment and big depressions. All we'd have would be the normal background of frictional unemployment as people moved from job to job and spent some time unemployed in between. And it's that, I think, that has me at least most shocked right now. That kind of 8 years ago I would have agreed when Kevin and Rajan's colleague Robert Lucas said we had solved the problem of depression prevention. And I'm still not sure how it has gone so wrong.
All right, final word, Dani.
Well, I think we need a mix of policies, and I think they have different time range. So we talk a lot about education and increasing the skills of our workforce, but that's really going to take time. So education cannot be the solution to the present generation's problems. So I think there also has to be some short-term remedies, and that will require taking care of the basic industrial base of the country and caring about what the value of the dollar is and what U.S. trade policy is.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you all. And my thanks, of course, to Kevin Murphy, Rajan, Dani, Rodrik, and Brad DeLong. I'm Emily Rooney. Goodbye.
Okay. Very civilized.
Yeah, the last one, the one, and then what happens is you can't really hear what
Because maybe we should be more Wheaties.
So that's why we got the lecture.
And what happens is you can't really hear what somebody's trying to say if it gets you're shouting over.
I also don't think, by and large, the topics we're dealing with lend themselves to incredible disagreements.
Friedman is talking about free market versus Soviet communism. Standing at the bamboo curtain with red china just on the other side.
So the range of views, I think, when I heard that this was going to be the panel, I was a little bit surprised because I can certainly name people way to the right of Kevin and way to the left of Brad, which we don't have.
Major funding was provided by CME Group. For more than 160 years, through continuous innovation in trading and technology, CME Group products have provided businesses with the opportunity to manage risk amid the changing financial landscape. BP is dedicated to helping meet America's energy needs. Our investments support jobs across the country and reaffirm our commitment to the U.S. that began over a century ago. Additional funding was provided by John A. Gunn and Cynthia Fry Gunn, the Melvin S. Cohen Foundation, FedEx Corporation, the L.E. Phillips Family Foundation, and Corrett Foundation.